In this video, we're going to look at how population scale data are used to interpret and evaluate environmental health issues. And what population scale data are large data sets involving many people across time or space. So specifically, I want to talk about correlation versus causation. I want to give you an idea of how spatial data patterning is used in epidemiology. And lastly, I'll just give you a quick introduction to the environmental causes of disease and why these are so important. In this video, I want to introduce you to some different kinds of data presentation. We'll talk about human health here, but the broad points from this video apply to a wide range of environmental topics. The first topic I want to talk about is correlation and causation in a statistical sense. And so to do that, I'm actually going to use some data that comes from the Centers for Disease Control Epidemiological Training Manual. Let's start pulling apart a few things on this graph so we can talk about what these data mean. If you look at the graph, we've got two bits of data that we need to look at. The first is education, and that's on the y-axis, and that's plotted against body mass index on the x-axis. These are data that were collected in the country of Jordan in 2012. From the top to the bottom of the y-axis, it goes illiterate, primary or elementary school, basic, secondary, intermediate university degree, and then graduate degree. So more education is at the bottom and less is at the top. On the x-axis is body mass index, and a higher number means more weight versus height, and a lower number means less weight versus height. A normal BMI would be between 18 and 24. Lastly, if you look at the data, there are four values presented here. The mean, which is the average of the data, is the little triangle in the figure. The vertical line is the median, which is the midpoint of the data. So if you have 100 points, that would be the value of point number 50 if you organize those 100 from smallest to largest. The interquartile range is the gray area, and that shows the mean plus or minus 25%. And then the total data range between the lowest and the highest value is shown with the bars. In any kind of data like this, there's the question of whether these groups are statistically significantly different from one another. That's a question that we're going to deal with elsewhere. But for now, let's say that there are real meaningful differences. And therefore, we can start to try to interpret this figure. If you look at the general patterns here, you can see that as you go from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph, or less education to more education, it appears the body mass index goes down. More education tends to correspond with a lower body mass index. This is what we call a correlation, and it means that there is a relationship between two variables. In this case, educational attainment, or degree level, and body mass index. Now we get to the interesting part, and a key part of environmental and health sciences, and that's the question of why this might be happening. In this case, there could be a lot of different explanations. One possibility is that people that make it past graduate school tend to eat less and exercise more. Another is that they make more money, and because they make more money, they buy healthier food, and so the body mass index is lower. But there are other more subtle possibilities as well. This data is from Jordan, and what if university degrees and graduate degrees typically are obtained by more men than women? Men tend to have a lower body mass index than women. So in fact, we might be looking at a difference in gender that's obscured by a y-axis that presents education. This is a really important point for the interpretation of all complex data like this. It's very hard to take the step from correlation, or a statistical relationship, to causation, which is the actual mechanism that explains the pattern. You have to be very careful in any data like this that you're not falsely making two variables equivalent, or jumping to conclusions about cause. In this case, there may be a relationship, but we really don't know why that's there, and it would take a lot more statistics to figure that out. This figure shows the outbreak of dengue fever in Cairns, Australia in August 2003. Dengue fever is a mosquito-borne viral disease common in the tropics that leads to high fever, headaches, vomiting, muscle and joint pain, and a particular type of skin rash. Now for disease outbreaks, whether that's dengue, malaria, COVID, or any other disease, the spatial patterning of data becomes very important. I'm sure you can kind of figure out why that would be. If you have an infectious disease that's located in one location and spreading person to person in that location, you would want to know whether or not that cluster really represented a spread of disease in a particular location or whether the same type of spread was occurring everywhere. Knowing the answer to that question lets public health authorities decide whether to quarantine a building, a neighborhood, or an entire city. Sound familiar in the era of COVID? If you look at this particular image, what we see is a very common epidemiological technique, which is to look for spatial clusters in the patterning of data. So now we're not talking about time clusters, we're not talking about, say, categorical clusters like male versus female, but actually spatial distributions of data. And this kind of spatial distribution becomes very important in this case for tracking a disease. But it also becomes really important for understanding a range of environmental health issues like air pollution exposure and impacts on health. Let me give you one example. If you think about freeways, there are a lot of cars and a lot of emission of pollutants. We'll talk about this more in the air pollution part of this course, but those pollutants don't travel forever. And in fact, they're usually more concentrated right around that freeway. Imagine who tends to live right next to freeways. In a large city, those folks are often the same demographic group that, say, lives in the mansions on the hill? Probably not. And so for air pollution, you can see this sort of spatial clustering can get at issues such as racial or economic inequality of exposure to air pollution. In this example, the issue is that people, by virtue of their economic or their racial status, tend to be located next to places of high pollution. They then are therefore disproportionately impacted by that pollution. This is a critical issue in environmental health, and to address it, there's a type of statistics called spatial statistics, and it's often done with geographical information systems, or GIS. We still have the same issues around correlation and causation in spatial data, but I think you can probably see how these types of data can be really useful for understanding and exploring patterns. The last graph I want to show you is actually from 1849. This again is from the Centers for Disease Control, so lest you think that environmental health is something new, this graph will prove otherwise. Environment and health are deeply linked for many diseases. And so this sort of research in epidemiology goes back to the 1800s. There are many diseases around the world that have a major environmental component or control. We're looking at cholera right here, which we'll talk about in a second, but malaria, dengue fever, schistosomiasis, and other issues like air pollution have an environmental component. These sorts of diseases or pollution issues affect huge numbers of people around the world and are controlled or influenced by some component of the physical or biological system. This is because the systems transport whatever it is, whether a virus or a bacterium or a contaminant, from a source of production to a source of impact. The data here show cholera deaths per 10,000 people versus the feet above the River Thames at high tide. So what you see in this particular graph is a correlation, right? Because we don't know what's happening, but we do see a pattern. We can then use that pattern to get a story of where to go next. What these data tell is that the people that lived in 1849, very close to the level of the River Thames at high tide, were the ones more likely to get cholera compared to those that were living up to 100 feet above the river. What this suggests, and I'm being careful with my language here, is that exposure to water at high tide in that river could be a cause of cholera in these populations. To really know, we need to do more work, but this type of data provides a roadmap for where to go. It turns out that cholera is a really dangerous bacterial waterborne infection that continues to be a major issue around the world, especially where human or animal waste come into contact with drinking water. This example from 1849 is still something that's important today for a range of environmental diseases and pollutants. So a quick wrap up of this video. First, correlation and causation. So we looked at this with human health data. It's often very messy. There are multiple commingled factors. You got to be very careful about attributing causation to something that's simply correlated. Second point, spatial data. We use it all the time in environmental science. It's really critical to understanding distribution spread, cause of disease, and many, many other topics. Something to pay attention to and a skill to develop if you're interested in this. Lastly,
We just got a hint of this. We'll get a lot more as we go forward. Environmental factors are critical to the spread and impact of disease, and really critical, of course, to environmental health. So we'll keep looking at this as we move forward through this course.